It was just a plain email, no greeting, no warmth, only a few short lines beneath Nana's signature, sent from her iPhone. The subject line read, "Holiday plans." I sat there staring at it for a full minute before opening it, even though I already knew what it was. Not a call from my son, not even a quick voice memo. Just that cold little glow from my screen with words that felt more like a reminder from a calendar than an invitation. For someone who once hand-painted the wrapping paper for his own birthday presents and baked 3 cakes because he couldn't choose a flavor, this moment landed harder than I wanted to admit. I wonder if any of you have ever read something so short, yet felt a little pull deep in your chest. That quiet tug. The kind that whispers you're no longer part of the story. The message said, "Christmas dinner will be at our house again this year around 5. Hope you can come." No name, no signature, no love, just that one word. Hope. Hope, like my presence was optional, like I was optional. It hadn't even come from Garrett. It came from Nina. That stung more than I wanted to admit. My son and I used to talk every single Sunday, even if it was just 10 minutes. Now I get a text once a month, and even those feel like receipts. Still, I sat there with it. I reread it. I stared out the window at the bare trees, their branches trembling in the cold wind. And then, after a long while, I replied, "Thank you, I'll be there." I typed it slowly, carefully, as if the words might shatter if I pressed too hard. I didn't ask if they needed anything. I didn't offer to bring food or help set up. I've learned better by now. I've been gently taught where the invisible line was, and this time, I wasn't going to cross it, not even by trying to make things easier for them. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. For a moment, I wondered what it would feel like if Garrett had called himself. If he had said, "Mom, I really want you there," but those thoughts don't help. They only scratch at old scabs that never fully heal. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet room. I glanced over at the corner cabinet where a box of Christmas decorations still sat unopened. I hadn't touched them yet. Maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. The invitation was cold, but I was still going, because sometimes, even when the door barely opens, we still walk through it, hoping something inside will be warmer than the way we were asked to come. I started with the mulling spices, not because they were necessary, but because the smell reminded me of winters when Garrett was small enough to curl up next to me on the couch with a book. Back then, cinnamon and orange peel would have him running straight into the kitchen, asking what I was baking. I never minded the interruptions back then. These days, the kitchen stays quiet, even when it's full. I opened the pantry and pulled out the mason jars. I had saved the last of the summer blueberries, preserved the way my mother once taught me. I added a hint of nutmeg and lemon zest and let the mixture cook slow. One small jar would go into the gift bag, tied with red twine and a handwritten label. The label was the most important part. I wrote, "From my kitchen, always with love." Next, I reached for the photo album. I'd started collecting pictures months ago, not for any reason in particular, just something to do when the house felt too still. Garrett's first Christmas, the photo of his missing front teeth, the little costume he wore for his second-grade nativity play. I arranged the pages carefully, alternating photos with small handwritten notes. Not to impress anyone, but to hold on to pieces only I seemed to remember. I paused when I reached the photo of us at the lake. He was 10, wrapped in a towel, laughing with chocolate smeared across his face. I had taken that photo just after he fell off the paddleboard and swore he'd never try again. The next morning, he got right back on. That was who he used to be: resilient, sweet, uncertain but wide open. I slipped the photo into the plastic sleeve and placed the album into a cloth bag stitched with a snowflake. Beside it, I tucked the jar of preserves and a folded letter I had written on stationery Garrett gave me 5 Christmases ago. Pale green with a thin gold border, the kind that makes even simple words feel important. I didn't write much, just enough to say that I hoped this year we'd share more than just space. That I missed the sound of his laughter, free and unguarded. That I still believed in second chances. The bag wasn't big. It wouldn't stand out under a glittering tree. But it carried 30 years of winter mornings, scraped knees, late-night school projects, and quiet prayers whispered through closed doors. I placed it by the front door, ready for the next morning. Even if I wasn't sure how I'd be received, I wanted to walk in holding something that reminded me of who I was. Not just Garrett's mother, but someone who still remembered how to love, even when the love wasn't returned. The sky had turned a soft, steely gray by the time I pulled into their neighborhood. Snow had already started gathering along the edges of the driveway, thin white veins stretching across the sidewalk. I parked by the curb and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle for a moment. From the outside, their house looked warm and alive. Light spilled through the windows, flickering across the front room, like a fireplace might be going. I could hear laughter, faint but clear, drifting above soft Christmas music. Someone was clinking glasses. A child's squeal carried through the air, high and bright. It all sounded lovely, almost as if I belonged there. I reached for the gift bag on the passenger seat, double-checking to make sure the photo album was still tucked safely inside. My gloves were in my coat pocket, but I didn't put them on. My hands were shaking, and I needed to feel the cold. The walk up the driveway felt longer than I remembered. I passed the row of hedges Garrett used to help me trim every summer, the ones I bought after he first moved in to give the place some curb appeal. They looked the same, just dusted and white now, brittle, bare, stripped of life. I climbed the steps slowly, careful not to slip on the thin ice. The doorbell was new, sleek, digital. I pressed it once. A soft chime rang inside, and silence. I waited. No footsteps. No shadow behind the frosted glass. Just more laughter in the background. I pressed it again, leaning in, listening closer this time. Still nothing. I stepped back, glanced around the porch. Snow had started to settle on my shoulders. The cuffs of my pants were damp, my boots soaking through. The gift bag sagged slightly in my hand under the weight of moisture. I stayed where I was. 10 more minutes passed. A car drove by slowly, tires crunching over fresh snow. The driver gave me a small nod and a wave. I nodded back, tried to smile, but my face felt stiff. There was no way to explain what I was doing there. No polite way to say I had been invited, but not expected. I stood another 5 minutes, then 10 more. The cold crept in, slow and steady, seeping deep into my bones, like grief that didn't need words. The front porch light flickered once, then steadied again. Still, no one came. I shifted the bag to my other hand. It had started to feel heavier than it should. Then, movement behind the curtain. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I saw a shadow, a shape, something stirring inside. And then it was gone. I rang the bell one last time. Not with anger, Not even with hope, just quiet finality. Then I stepped back to the sidewalk and waited. I told myself I would give it 5 more minutes. Just 5. After all, I had promised I would come. And I had, even if no one opened the door. Finally, the door creaked open. Garrett stood there, his expression blank, not welcoming, not annoyed, just distant, like he had stepped into a room and forgotten why. He blinked twice, then said my name, more like reminding himself than greeting me. I nodded and lifted the soggy gift bag slightly. He didn't reach for it. He just stepped aside. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately. The scent of pine and cinnamon hung heavy in the air, thick and sweet. Twinkling lights danced across the tree in the corner. The living room was full, coats draped across the backs of chairs, half-finished drinks lined up along the mantel, shoes kicked off near the baseboards. From somewhere in the kitchen, someone laughed loudly. A little girl darted past, litter stuck in her hair. Nina appeared from the hallway, her lipstick perfect, wearing a cream sweater dress and gold earrings that sparkled under the pendant light. She glanced at me, smiled faintly, and said, "Oh, we thought you might not make it. We got caught up with everything." She didn't take the gift bag either. She motioned toward the dining room before turning back mid-conversation, with someone behind her. Garrett gestured vaguely toward the front closet, so I hung my coat there myself. The hook was loose. I remembered tightening it 3 years ago, back when they first moved in, back when I still carried a small toolkit in my purse, just in case they needed something. The dining table was already full, 12 seats, everyone taken. A folding chair had been added at the very end, half tucked into the walkway. That one was mine. I knew without asking. I slid into it and placed the gift bag on my lap. My knees pressed against the edge of a plant stand. The album inside the bag bent slightly under the pressure. No one asked about my drive. No one mentioned the snow. A woman across the table gave me a polite smile, then turned back to her conversation. I tried to listen. Something about ski reservations. Something about a new backsplash in someone's kitchen. The food came in heavy ceramic dishes: ham, green beans, mashed sweet potatoes. It all looked beautiful. Nina moved gracefully through the room, refilling glasses, laughing at just the right moments. Garrett sat 3 seats away. He caught my eye once, nodded, and then looked away. When dessert came, I reached for the bag on my lap, thinking maybe now would be the moment. Maybe someone would ask what I brought. But the moment passed. The conversation didn't pause. The space around me stayed untouched. I set the bag gently beside my chair. Someone asked Nina where she got the glasses. She said they were a wedding gift from Garrett's aunt. I had bought that set. She didn't mention that part. I swallowed the rest of my coffee and smiled when someone passed me a dish. I held it steady as they served themselves, without looking at me. The light shimmered overhead. My chair wobbled slightly on the uneven tile. I nudged it into place with my foot and said nothing. I had been let in, but I had not been welcomed. After dinner, the kids were sent into the den with puzzles and cocoa. The adults stayed behind, lingering over pie and decaf. I stayed in my folding chair, my hands folded quietly in my lap. The gift bag sat beside me, untouched, still unopened. I watched Garrett laugh at something Nina said. His posture was loose, his shoulders easy, the kind of comfort that comes when a man feels certain the room belongs to him. I remembered that same curve in his shoulders when he used to collapse onto our old couch after football practice, sweaty and exhausted. But the boy I had raised, the one who once called me from the school hallway just to tell me his spelling test score, had grown into someone different. His gestures now were practiced, measured, polite, detached. Nena's niece came skipping back into the room. She couldn't have been more than 7. She stopped in front of me, her head tilted, squinting as if trying to place a face she couldn't quite remember. Then she turned to Nina and asked in a loud whisper, "Is she the cleaning lady, like Miss Janice at my school?" A few soft chuckles broke out around the table, quiet, uneasy, muffled into hands. Nina laughed the loudest. She waved her hand like it was nothing, like kids just said silly things sometimes, but she didn't correct her. Garrett didn't either. I sat perfectly still. I didn't correct anyone, not because I agreed, but because the room didn't feel like mine anymore. I had been invited, but not expected, present, but unseen. Someone started stacking plates at the far end of the table. I heard Nina lean toward Garrett, her voice low but clear enough for me to catch. "We'll need to get a cleaning crew for next time." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. The silence that followed carried it anyway. I stayed quiet. I stood slowly and gathered the gift bag from beside my chair. The jar inside shifted, clinking softly against the edge of the photo album. I didn't open it. I didn't offer it anymore. Instead, I placed it gently behind my chair, out of the way, like something someone might stumble upon later and wonder who left behind. A soft hum of Christmas music played from the living room speaker. Someone lit a new candle, vanilla and cedar, sweet enough to make my throat tight. I walked to the hallway, my steps silent on the tile. The walls were lined with framed photos, a family beach trip. Garrett in sunglasses, his arm wrapped around Nina, their daughter in a sequined dance costume, her smile wide and perfect. All recent, all polished. There were none of the old ones. None of the baby pictures I'd taken, the ones I'd carefully labeled and framed. None from our old backyard where Garrett used to run barefoot in the sprinklers. Not even his high school graduation, where I stood in the front row clapping until my hands stung, cheering louder than anyone. It was as if I had been gently, carefully erased. I returned to the table just as Nina walked in carrying a tray of tiny cheesecakes. She smiled at me softly, vaguely, like someone greeting a distant cousin whose name they couldn't quite recall. Garrett avoided my gaze entirely. I sat back down in the folding chair, my hands resting on my knees. No one asked if I wanted dessert. No one asked if I wanted coffee. No one asked me anything at all. The gift bag was still behind my chair, still unopened, still unseen. I watched the others talk, their conversations weaving effortlessly together, overlapping, laughing, stories spilling one into another. But none of those threads touched me. The evening unfolded without a single question, without a single invitation to join. I had always known families could drift apart. I just hadn't realized mine had done it while I was still sitting right there in the room. When the dishes were cleared and most of the guests began leaving, the house grew quieter. I stood near the hallway, uncertain whether I was expected to stay or go. No one said a word. No one offered a blanket. No one mentioned the guest room. Garrett was in the kitchen, helping Nina stack containers of leftovers. Neither of them looked my way. It was late now. The wind had picked up outside, and snow swirled against the windows, piling higher along the driveway. I cleared my throat softly and walked toward the den. There was a small pull-out sofa in the playroom. Not a real bed, not even a proper guest space. Just something the kids used for movie nights and sleepovers. I had seen it once before when I dropped off a box of old books Nina never acknowledged. The sofa creaked as I sat down slowly. I slipped off my shoes and folded my coat neatly over the armrest. There was no pillow. The only blanket nearby was a small fleece throw printed with cartoon dinosaurs. I pulled it over me anyway, knees bent tightly to fit. The lights were dim, but I could still see the shelves lined with plastic bins of toys, stacks of puzzles, and a globe missing entire countries. On the far wall hung a finger-painted family tree. My name wasn't on it. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest heavy in a way words couldn't hold. I lay still and stared at the ceiling. Years ago, I used to work overnight shifts in the hospital kitchen. 14 hours on my feet, tray after tray of soft food and lukewarm coffee. I would come home just before sunrise, aching, and still make Garrett's lunch before he left for school. Back then, it never felt like sacrifice. It felt like love. And now, here I was in a house I had quietly helped fund, sleeping on a sofa meant for toddlers. No one had even said good night. I pulled the thin dinosaur blanket tighter around me. The sounds of the house filtered faintly through the door, and muffled laughter from the living room, the clinking of glasses, the steady hum of the dishwasher. None of it included me. I closed my eyes and told myself this was temporary, just for tonight. But deep down, it felt like more than that. It felt like a line had been drawn somewhere when I wasn't looking. A line that said, "You were once needed. Now you're just here." Like a lamp left plugged in, too sentimental to throw away, too outdated to use double quotes. A door clicked shut somewhere in the house, followed by silence. I lay there, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the low rumble of the furnace switching on, all the familiar sounds of a home that wasn't mine anymore. I thought of the gift bag still behind the chair in the dining room. Maybe someone would find it tomorrow. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. I turned on my side, hugging the small fleece blanket close. My eyes stayed open for a long time. It had taken me a lifetime to build this family, and just one night to realize I had been quietly written out of it. Morning came slowly, gray light slipping through the thin curtains in the playroom. I sat up stiffly, rubbing my shoulder where it had pressed against the edge of the sofa all night. The blanket had slid to the floor sometime before dawn. My back ached, my neck pulled tight from curling into a space too small for comfort. The house was already stirring. I could hear Nina in the kitchen, her voice low but firm, probably giving Garrett instructions about leftovers or recycling. Their movements were unhurried, steady, just another morning after just another holiday. I folded the dinosaur blanket neatly and placed it back on the sofa. Then I slipped into the hallway quietly, careful not to disturb anyone. Garrett was at the counter pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up when he saw me, hesitated, then offered a small smile, soft but rehearsed, like greeting an acquaintance you haven't seen in years. I stood there, waiting, unsure if something more would follow. Nina appeared behind him, already dressed, polished, holding her phone. Garrett set the mugs down and cleared his throat. He said they had been thinking. There was a senior community nearby, just a few minutes out of town, spacious, private, peaceful. They had driven past it once and thought of me. He said it would be perfect, quiet but not isolated. I would have my own place, my own space. He called it freedom, independence. I listened in silence. Nina nodded beside him, smiling lightly, her voice smooth as she added, "It's about making sure you're comfortable. You deserve peace." The words slid out cleanly, practiced, polished. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even really a request. It was a direction, gentle, polite, but clear. They no longer saw me as part of this house. Not even in its corners. I had become something to be placed, a box to be tucked neatly away, a responsibility checked off a list. I smiled faintly and thanked them for thinking of me. Garrett looked relieved. Nina turned back to her phone. No one asked how I'd slept. No one asked what I had hoped for when I came. I slipped on my coat, the hook still loose beneath my hand. The hallway mirror caught a slant of cold winter light from the window. I barely recognized the woman reflected back at me, pale, quiet, smaller than she used to be. But the eyes remembered everything. I told them I'd think about it. Garrett nodded and offered to email me the brochure. I nodded too. Then I stepped out into the cold. My car waited where I'd left it, dusted with snow, sitting alone at the curb. I slid into the driver's seat and sat for a moment before turning the key. The house behind me stayed still. No curtain shifted, no door cracked open. It was done. They had made their suggestion, and I had heard it loud and clear. The road home felt longer than it should have. I drove in silence, the heater struggling against the cold. My fingers were stiff on the steering wheel. The sky hung low, a heavy gray that swallowed sound and color. Everything outside looked dipped in ice water. When I reached the cabin, it stood just where I left it, quiet, steady, surrounded by pine trees heavy with snow. It was small, but it was mine, bought years ago with overtime pay I had saved, tucked away for weekend escapes that never really happened. Now it would be more than an escape. It would be a return to something I hadn't named yet, but needed. Inside, the air was still and cold. I turned on the lamps, lit the fireplace, slipped into the wool slippers waiting by the door. The wood creaked under my feet as I walked to the small kitchen and set the kettle on the stove. My hands moved without thought, reaching for the same tea bags I'd always used. There was no voicemail from Garrett. No follow-up text. No email with the brochure. I wasn't surprised. I pulled the old financial folder from the cabinet above the sink. The spine was worn, the edges frayed, thick with papers and handwritten notes to myself. I opened to the page marked in red ink. The house Garrett and Nina lived in, the one I helped them move into, the one I still fixed loose hooks for, was still under my name. I had kept it that way to make things easier for them. I thought it would feel like a gift, like a foundation for them to build on. I never imagined they would build something that didn't include me at all. There were other papers, too. Bank account access, college savings for their daughter, automatic payments I had set up for their utilities years ago and never thought to cancel. Back then, I called it helping. Now I saw it for what it had become. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand and made a list. Then I picked up the phone. First, I called the bank. I closed the credit card tied to their account. I removed Garrett's name from the education fund. The woman on the other end asked if I was sure. I said yes, and I meant it. Then I called my lawyer. The house would be placed into a private trust, not for Garrett, not for Nina, but for something better. A community fund to support retired nurses. Women like me, who had worked quietly for decades and ended up just as quietly forgotten. I would keep the cabin. My name, my quiet. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady against the quiet trees. I watched from the window, my cup of tea cooling in my hand. My reflection in the glass looked steadier than it had the day before. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to make space for me. I was claiming my own. The cabin had always been a place of quiet, not the lonely kind, but the kind that lets your thoughts breathe and stretch. Over the next few days, I filled that silence with action. I called the bank again and canceled the automatic transfers I had set up long ago, their heating bill, their internet, all the little things I had been paying for long after they stopped noticing. I contacted the institution managing their daughter's college fund and froze it. That one took longer. I had to answer 3 security questions. Each one reminded me how much of their life had been built on my fingerprints. When the documents arrived, I printed them carefully and laid them out on the dining table. My name's still there, their names gone. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closing a door that had been left open too long, letting in too much cold. 2 days later, Garrett called. His voice was tight, clipped around the edges. He didn't mention the house. He didn't mention the accounts. Instead, he said something had come up and asked if I had made any changes. I told him yes. There was a long pause on the line. Then he asked if we could talk about it. I said there wasn't much to discuss. I told him I had thought about the offer he and Nina made, the one about the senior home. I told him I had declined, not because it wasn't nice, but because I no longer wanted to be placed anywhere. I would choose my own space. He sounded confused, then frustrated. He said things were complicated right now, that Nina was stressed, that the mortgage was due. I stayed silent. Finally, he asked what had changed. I said, "Nothing has changed. I've just stopped pretending." He didn't respond right away. I could hear his breath on the other end, the same sound he used to make as a little boy when he knew he was wrong, but didn't want to admit it. After a long pause, he said he understood, but I knew he didn't. Understanding would have come years ago, when I stood outside his door in the snow. When his daughter mistook me for the cleaning lady. When Nina set out place cards, and mine wasn't there. This wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition. I had spent decades pouring everything I had into a family that no longer saw me. Now I was pulling that energy back, not to hurt them, but to remember myself. Snow piled higher against the porch, soft drifts settling into quiet folds. I stepped outside with my tea and stood very still, letting the wind brush across my face. This place was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. 3 days later, Garrett called again. This time, his voice was softer. He asked if he could stop by with his daughter. No details, just a visit. I said yes. Not because I wanted closure. I had already started building that myself, but because I was curious which version of him would arrive. The son who once held my hand crossing the street, or the man who left me standing outside his door. They came just before noon. The snow had melted into slush along the gravel drive, and their car crunched to a stop near the porch. I stayed seated at the kitchen table and let them find their way in. Garrett stepped inside first, carrying a paper bag. He glanced around the cabin like it belonged to a stranger. His daughter followed close behind, clutching a sketchbook. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, and when she saw me, she smiled, shy but genuine. I offered them tea. Garrett nodded. We sat quietly while the kettle warmed. The silence wasn't heavy this time, just unfamiliar, like we were all adjusting to a room that had changed shape. He handed me the bag. Inside was a loaf of banana bread and a small jar of honey. Store-bought, but still, it felt like an effort. I thanked him and poured the tea. We sat together, steam curling softly from our cups. Garrett looked older to me than he had just a week ago. Not from age, but from something heavier, a weight I could no longer carry for him. He didn't mention the accounts. He didn't bring up the house. Instead, he said things had been overwhelming. Nena's job, the mortgage, the holidays. I listened. He said he missed how things used to be, that he wanted to find a better way forward. I nodded. He didn't apologize, but he said he hoped we could talk more often, maybe even share Sunday dinners again. He said it like an invitation, but also like a favor. I told him I needed time. I told him I wasn't angry, but I wasn't willing to disappear anymore. He nodded slowly and placed his hand around his cup. No hug, no request to stay. His daughter drew quietly at the end of the table. Before leaving, she walked over and handed me the sketchbook page she'd been working on. It was a drawing of the cabin, a woman in a red coat standing outside, a small fox curled at her feet. I smiled and thanked her. Garrett hesitated at the door, like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. They left quietly. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching their car disappear down the drive. The embrace never came, and I didn't wait for it. Some distances can't be walked back with words. Some silences are better left untouched. Inside, the cabin felt the same. And yet, something inside me had shifted. I pinned the drawing to the fridge. Then I poured another cup of tea. The snow outside blanketed the lake in a soft hush. From my window, I watched the wind sweep across the surface, carrying thin wisps of powder-like breath on glass. The trees stood heavy with winter, tall and unmoved. Inside, it was warm, the kind of warmth that doesn't just come from fire, but from decision. I began writing small thoughts on scraps of paper. Not letters, not journals, just words I wanted to keep, things I had never given myself permission to say out loud. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door, gentle, unhurried. It was Carol, my neighbor from across the lake. She was older than me by a few years, soft-eyed, with strong, capable hands. She lived alone too, in a small greenhouse tucked near the trailhead. She held out a tin of cookies and said a group of women met every Thursday at the recreation hall. Retired nurses, former caregivers, mothers who had raised entire families and now found themselves in quiet houses scattered through the woods. She said I would be welcome. I thanked her and accepted the cookies. Later that night, I sat by the fire and read the flyer she left behind. *Lantern Women. That was the name of the group. Something about it stayed with me. Lanterns, quiet sources of light. Not loud, not blazing, just steady. The next morning, I bundled up and walked the snowy trail to the hall. Snow crunched under my boots, my breath rising in small clouds. When I arrived, the door was already open. Inside, soft laughter carried through the warm air. Carol waved me over. No introductions. No questions I didn't want to answer. Just a mug already poured and a chair waiting. I sat down. One woman knitted. Another sorted old photographs. Someone scribbled in a notebook. No one asked me to explain myself. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to. I stayed for 2 hours. When I walked back to the cabin, the air felt lighter. Not because anything outside had changed, but because I had. I opened the tin of cookies and made tea. Across the lake, a light flickered on in Carol's house, and I didn't feel alone anymore. Winter settled deep into the trees. The lake froze solid, a sheet of pale glass stretched under the muted sky. Each evening, I lit a small candle on the windowsill. I hadn't planned to. It just became a way to mark the days. A quiet reminder that I was still here, still choosing this life. That week, I rewrote my will. Not in anger, not to punish anyone, but with intention. Garrett's name wasn't included. The cabin would go to a fund supporting aging nurses with no family. The rest would fund scholarships for daughters of single mothers pursuing caregiving work. Not because I owed anyone anything, but because I finally understood where my legacy belonged. When I signed the papers, there were no tears, no hesitation, just the quiet sound of a pen moving across the page. Later, I sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, hands curled around a mug of warm cider. The snow fell gently, brushing against the railing, the windows, the ground. The world felt hushed, but not empty. I didn't think about Garrett much anymore. Not with bitterness, just with distance. There was a time when his approval measured my worth, when I believed being loved meant being needed. But now, in the stillness of this cabin, I know better. Being needed is not the same as being seen, and I choose now to be both. The candle flickered softly on the windowsill. Outside, the pines whispered as the wind moved through their branches. I closed my eyes. This, I thought, is peace. Not the kind that comes after conflict. The kind you build slowly, with your own hands. The kind that doesn't ask to be noticed, but endures anyway. And for me, that was enough.